I simply don't see one single overarching legally binding instrument that covers all aspects of space. Norms, standards, and best practices will surely be part of the mix. Now, given the dual-use potential of space technology, I'm pleased to see that discussions also seem to be moving away from a focus on technologies and capabilities towards a focus on behaviors.
Hey, SpaceWatchers, and welcome back to our Space Café Radio today. I have the great honor to speak with one of the most respected voices in space governance and sustainability, Dr. Peter Martinez, the Executive Director of the Secure World Foundation. And we will talk about the Foundation's latest work, including the 2025 edition of their Global Counter Space Capability Report, the indispensable UN COPUOS Briefing Book, and we dive into the upcoming 7th Summit for Space Sustainability in Paris in September. And we will hear the Secure World Foundation's take on the EU Emerging Space Act. Dr. Martinez, welcome to Space Café Radio. How are you doing today?
Very well, thank you, Torsten. Thanks very much for having me on your show, and greetings to your listeners.
Wonderful. Peter, let's start with a broader picture for our audience who may not follow the Secure World Foundation's work daily. How would you summarize the Foundation's current mission and key strategic priorities in 2025?
That's great. Thanks for the questions. Torsten, as we all know, space delivers many societal benefits to citizens all over the world, regardless of the level of development of their own country in space affairs. But space is also becoming increasingly congested with active satellites and contaminated with space debris, which poses a risk to our ability to continue to enjoy these societal benefits indefinitely into the future. So Secure World Foundation's mission is to ensure that we maintain space as a safe, orderly, and stable operating domain for all space actors so that all nations can enjoy the benefits of space activities, and space will continue to be accessible to all countries that are still emerging space nations. So, broadly speaking, this has come to be known as space sustainability. Now, I don't particularly like the term, but we're stuck with it. And now, when we talk about space sustainability, we're not just referring to orbital debris, but to a much wider set of issues. The debris is symptomatic of the underlying unsustainable behaviors and practices going back to the early days of the space age. And space sustainability is a kind of a rubric for a wide set of challenges at really different spatial and temporal scales. In that Secure World, we address the various dimensions of space sustainability. The way we work is by convening dialogues, by conducting research, and by socializing internationally agreed best practices, such as the UN COPUOS guidelines for the long-term sustainability of space activities. Now, you asked about current priorities. In general terms, I would say that our efforts generally support the progressive development of space governance to address the different dimensions of space sustainability. Among these, for example, is working towards some form of space traffic coordination. And a necessary precursor for this is information exchange and figuring out what kinds of information need to be exchanged, with what period of relevancy, and how to do it effectively. This is one example of an area where we support multi-stakeholder dialogues. I hope that gives listeners a sense of Secure World's role and focus.
No, absolutely. And thank you very much for summarizing that upfront. One of the Secure World Foundation's most cited resources is the Global Counter Space Capability Report. And here in its 25th edition that has just been released. What are the key findings this year and what trends concerns you most?
Yeah, indeed. The Counter Space Report is one of our most popular publications. I would say it's the one that we receive the most kudos from our readers and the one that is most anticipated each year. The report compiles and assesses publicly available information on counter space capabilities. This year, we surveyed 12 countries and we look at them across 5 different categories, namely direct ascent, co-orbital, electronic warfare, directed energy, and cyber. And you asked about worrying trends. I would say the first indication of a worrying trend is that our report has literally doubled in size since we started it in 2018, which just shows how counter-space capabilities are proliferating around the world. We started with 6 countries in 2018, and this year's edition covers 12 countries. So this year we're covering in the report the US, Russia, China, India, Australia, France, Iran, Japan, North Korea, South Korea, and the United Kingdom, if memory serves me correctly. The report assesses the current and near-term future capabilities for each country that we survey, along with their potential military utility. And among the findings in this year's report, we note the following. Firstly, I suppose you could consider this good news, is that we note that while there is a proliferation of R&D into destructive and non-destructive counter-space capabilities, to date, only non-destructive counter-space capabilities are being used in active conflicts. Secondly, we notice that we're witnessing more uncoordinated close approaches by the major space powers of each other's spacecraft, and our report gives an update on these activities. We've also noted a recent shift by the US in being more open in discussing developing offensive counter-space capabilities. We also refer to how Russia's GPS jamming is increasingly affecting civil aviation and the other disruptive effects of Russian jamming. And of course, as it was big news in 2024, we also include a discussion of Russia's alleged development of a nuclear ASAT capability. So just some highlights of this year's report, which is available for free download on our website. The full report is available in English. The executive summary is available in the other 5 official languages of the United Nations.
That's very interesting because I remember that we interviewed Brian Whedon in one of the first editions. And as you said, it's expanded so much. But do you see new entrants or actors changing the strategic balance in space security? And how has commercial counterspace evolved?
So that's an interesting question. Definitely, we are seeing new entrants, and that is changing the balance. I think also space security discussions are no longer dominated by the 3 major space powers, but there are now more countries with literally skin in the game. This will change the discussion. I think we're also noticing a shift in what is the focus of discussions from looking at technologies and capabilities to looking at behaviors. And so this is, I think, a welcome development because it's very difficult to regulate capabilities.
Let's talk about the other book, the COPUOS Briefing Book. That's another invaluable resource ahead of every UN session, I would say so. Can you tell us how Secure World Foundation curates that and how it's helping delegates, especially from the emerging space nations?
Thanks. I would say that the briefing book is one of the ways that we support effective multilateralism in space governance, and in particular with the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, UN COPUOS, hence the name of the book, the COPUOS Briefing Book. So for listeners who are not too familiar with UN COPUOS, let me provide some context by saying that the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space is the leading international forum for the progressive development and codification of principles of space governance. This is a forum that has produced the 5 major space treaties, but also many principles, guidelines, resolutions, etc., on space activities over the years. COPUOS is one of the largest standing committees in the UN and now comprises over 100 member states. I think it's 106 as of the latest count. And for a delegate who is new to the committee, and many delegates are not only new to COPUOS, but new to space issues, there is a very steep learning curve. There's also a capacity issue in the sense that only the largest countries, space powers, have the capacity to have specialized experts on all the agenda topics of COPUOS. And many delegations are small and don't have the breadth or depth to cover all of the agenda items with the same level of expertise. So we developed the COPUOS Briefing Book to facilitate this transition and to empower new delegates to COPUOS and the smaller delegations to engage constructively in this very important UN committee. The briefing book describes the history, the methods of work, and the achievements of the committee, as well as the current topical agenda issues. Over the past year, we have updated the COPUOS Briefing Book and partnered with a fellow permanent observer organization in COPUOS, Intersputnik, to translate it into French, Spanish and Russian, hopefully broadening the access of the briefing book to many more delegations. This book, as with all of our other publications, is available for free online as a PDF download. And we also bring copies to each session of COPUOS to distribute to the interested parties, and those copies generally go very quickly. We've gotten very positive feedback so far on the briefing book, and we're very pleased occasionally to see delegations referring to it or having it on their desk next to their microphone during a COPUOS session. So we feel that it is meeting a real need. Just also want to say that for your listeners who may be users of the briefing book, we would very much welcome feedback to improve future editions of this book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know one of the topics discussed in COPUOS is space safety and security, and that's an issue I would like to discuss with you also about. So you, Secure World Foundation, and yourself in person, you have been long advocated for norms of behavior and responsible conduct in space. Where do you see the most tangible process in terms of international consensus? And where are we still stuck? We're talking about the open-ended working group and the process or non-process there. So can you get some light in that?
Yeah, okay. You mentioned process, but I think you were also, in a sense, hinting at progress, right? Are we making progress? Sometimes people say that COPUOS is all about, these international fora, all about process and not progress. I get it. But I would say that the most tangible demonstration of progress was the adoption of the guidelines for the long-term sustainability of space activities by the UN in 2019, and their subsequent implementation by a growing number of UN member states. We're seeing more and more states referring to their national implementation of these guidelines, which, though voluntary, nevertheless, states are implementing them in their national regulatory processes, giving them some kind of legal character, which is great. Now, some folks will say that there's nothing new in those guidelines that responsible actors weren't already doing. But the point to note is that those guidelines have raised the bar on what is an internationally agreed minimum standard of responsible behavior. We didn't have such a standard before that. Of course, if some actors can set and achieve more aspirational goals, that's great. And in due course, others will follow their example, and that's how we achieve a progressive improvement over time. Now, where are we still stuck? Frustratingly, I would say we're still stuck on some really basic things, like basic operator contact information, for example. We still have situations where an operator whose spacecraft is predicted to be in a conjunction with another spacecraft and needs to coordinate with the other operator on who will move may not know how to contact the operator of the other spacecraft or even who it belongs to. We still don't have universal agreement on what kinds of information should be exchanged, in what way, and with what time relevance. I'm talking about things like universal publication of orbital information in a form useful for conjunction analysis, pre-maneuver notifications, thresholds for maneuvering, rules of movement for collision avoidance, and so on. At the moment, many operators do their own thing, and some are literally operating in the dark. Some of the large commercial operators have stepped into the breach and have published their orbital information, maneuver plans, and orbital safety best practices. We saw, for example, a few years ago, SpaceX, Iridium, and OneWay coming together to release their joint document called Satellite Orbital Safety Best Practices. This brings to mind another area where we are still somewhat stuck, namely how we bring the perspectives and experience of the commercial operators into COPUOS, which is an intergovernmental forum that was established when states were the dominant space actors, whereas today, the majority of satellites in orbit are those of commercial actors, yet they do not have a voice in COPUOS. So I hope COPUOS will find ways to draw on the best practices of industry to shape global space traffic coordination in the future. This is a very important issue. On the security side, progress has been very slow and stuck largely over different views, and I would say persistent views, on what are the real priorities for space security and whether space security is best achieved through legally binding or non-binding mechanisms. Personally, I've always thought that this legally binding versus non-binding debate is a false dichotomy. and that what we will ultimately wind up with is a combination of both. I simply don't see one single overarching legally binding instrument that covers all aspects of space. Norms, standards, and best practices will surely be part of the mix. Now, given the dual use potential of space technology, I'm pleased to see that discussions also seem to be moving away from a focus on technologies and capabilities towards a focus on behaviors. And there have been some interesting, promising developments in the UN system, slow but promising in terms of building a common understanding on what space security means to different countries. And as I mentioned earlier on, many more countries have skin in the game now, and so they are concerned. They see space security as their own concern, not just the concern of a few leading spacefaring nations.
We can't talk about space or safety and security without mentioning space traffic management, debris mitigation, and active debris removal. They are hot topics. And how does the Secure World Foundation engage in the conversations on space safety, and what regulatory or industry gaps do you think urgently need attention?
Yeah, indeed. Space debris and debris mitigation, otherwise known as active debris removal or ADR, are hot topics. And when it comes to the regulatory and industry gaps, I see a kind of a chicken and egg situation here. And I say this from a perspective of having been a regulator myself in the past. So regulators often cannot impose a post-mission disposal requirement because that requirement may be too onerous on a licensee and because the capabilities may not be readily available. And industry, on the other hand, has little incentive to develop a capability for which there is no regulatory requirement that would create a market for that capability. We've seen some successful technical demonstrations of debris removal concepts, but the main problem is that because there is as yet no universal requirement for debris removal, there is no business case for debris removal. So little incentive for lots and lots of companies to work on developing innovative ideas for these capabilities. However, I think there is a business case for satellite life extension services like on-orbit servicing, refueling, etc. So I think the way this will develop is that capabilities for in-orbit servicing will come about, for which there will be customers, and those capabilities will also be useful for ADR. And once those capabilities exist and are proven, it'll be easier for regulators to impose a post-mission disposal requirement on licensees to dispose of a spacecraft at its end of life, either through its own technological means, or if those fail, or if a licensee chooses not to include PMD capabilities in the spacecraft itself, then to require that licensee to procure those post-mission disposal from a commercial service provider. Now, I can foresee potential legal questions around different states of registry for spacecraft to be disposed of and the service of spacecraft, but I believe that those can be ironed out if there is a willing customer and a willing service provider situation, and there's a sort of a regulatory system in place for post-mission disposal. On a technical level, we will have to develop standards for close proximity operations, and groups like Confers have already made a start on this with the development of the first ISO standards for this kind of activity. Speaking of disposal, there is one issue that is starting to gain salience, and that is the sustainability of atmospheric post-mission disposal. Right now, this is the standard disposal method for LEO spacecraft, but there are growing concerns about the impact on the atmosphere of potentially thousands of re-entries per year in future. And this is an area where much research is still needed. But if it turns out that atmospheric disposal is harmful for the atmosphere, this may push us towards repurposing, reusing, and recycling spacecraft materials in space. And this could provide the impulse for new types of commercial space activities in future.
Wow, that opens a brand new thread of thoughts here. If we can't dispose our satellites into the Earth's atmosphere anymore, what does it mean for the now upcoming VLEO constellations that are out there, and so on and so forth? But it's an interesting thought for another conversation that we will have potentially in the future. Let's stick on the sustainability item. Let's turn to Paris. Meanwhile, the 7th Summit for Space Sustainability. And this year it is back in Europe in Paris. So what's the overarching theme of the summit this year, and what makes this one different from previous editions?
Yeah, we're very excited to be holding this year's Summit for Space Sustainability in Paris on the 22nd and 23rd of October. And we call it the Summit for Space Sustainability, not the Summit on Space Sustainability, because we don't only want to discuss the challenges to space sustainability, but also the potential policy, regulatory, and technical solutions. You ask what is different about this year. Each year is different, really. Each year, the focus of the summit is adjusted based on emerging trends and challenges, the location and interests of the host country, and of course, the outcome of new research. We chose to bring the summit to Europe this year to acknowledge and build on Europe's growing leadership in space sustainability, both on the policy and regulation front, but also on the development of technologies to support space sustainability. This year's summit will focus on the theme of acting with intention and the connection between sustainability, stability, and societal benefits, and even benefits with the space sector. For us, sustainability and commercial viability are very much interlinked. Different sessions of this year's summit will be focusing on issues like the policy updates and key initiatives. And of course, there we're really looking forward to updates on the new European Space Act, impacts of space activities on the atmosphere, as we were just mentioning a couple of minutes ago, different viewpoints on space security and stability, and also on the role and viability of commercial space sustainability services as part of the growing space economy. The full agenda of the summit is available on the website swfsummit.org, and we look forward to welcoming many of your listeners to the event, and hopefully you too, Thorsten.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure to attend, and we will put all the links in the show notes for you to just click on it. That's most easy. Which stakeholders or voices are you most keen to bring together at this year's summit, and what tangible outcomes are you aiming for? Because I know it's not just another conference, so you do it with a purpose.
Absolutely, yeah. In recent editions of the summit, we've tended to run each summit as a regionally focused, an international but regionally focused event that brings together the key stakeholders from government, industry, and academia from that region, as well as critical overseas partners. We've always envisaged the summit to have two goals. Firstly, as a sort of a forward-leaning substantive agenda that convenes a unique group of individuals that focus on space sustainability across all of the dimensions of the topic. We want to break through the silos and provide a stage for this year particularly, detailed analysis of recent developments in Europe and especially the new European Space Act. And we also want to ensure that critical space sustainability technologies continue to remain on target and explore how they can address all of the emerging space sustainability issues, like, for example, the atmospheric entry effects that we were talking about.
When we last met, that was in Brussels a few weeks back, and you mentioned it now twice, the EU Space Act. It's the EU Space Forum in Brussels. That was exactly 5 days after the EU Space Act draft was released. It was the talk of the town. And I know it's a hard question because it's an extensive document, but from your external but highly observant perspective, what are your first thoughts on this act?
Yeah, so I'm not going to get into the specifics of the act as we are still studying it with great interest, and we're not yet in a position to deliver considered comments on specific aspects of the act. But I will say that I think the goal of harmonizing space governance, which is one of the golden strands running through the act, has much merit. In the same way that we have a uniform system of governance in the maritime and aeronautical domain. I think the challenge will come with implementation and striking the right balance between what gets written into the act, in other words, what is set into law and therefore very hard to change, versus what gets addressed through implementing regulations, which can be more nuanced and more responsive to developments in the rapidly evolving space arena. But to answer your question, yes, I do believe that in general, this does set a positive tone for governance from a space sustainability and safety perspective, and it may provide an interesting model for other regions to observe. We'll certainly be following developments around the Act with great interest, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions around the Act at our upcoming summit in October.
I can hear your diplomatic past speaking out of you. So what is great. But it was very safe what you said. And I think that's at the moment a common consensus on interpretations of the Act as we all have studied it. Great. So looking ahead, the next 12 to 18 months, what are the top 3 developments or decisions in the global space governance landscape that you'll be watching most closely? So what you're looking forward? I'm quite sure the EU Space Act is one among them, but what else?
Yeah, in terms of what else, as we are based in the United States and the US being major space power, of course, we are watching developments here very closely. In fact, I think in the week that we were in Brussels, NOAA's fiscal year 26 budget proposal was released at the end of June, and it included plans to gut the Office of Space Commerce and terminate federal funding for the Traffic Coordination System for Space, or TRACS, on the basis that the private sector had demonstrated that it could provide SSA and space traffic management services envisaged. There was, as you can imagine, a strong pushback from the U.S. domestic space industry. And subsequently, the Senate Appropriations Committee disagreed with the cutting funding for the Act and agreed to provide funding to continue and expand the operational capabilities of TRACS. And about a week later, House appropriators followed suit. So for now, it looks as though TRACS may be safe. But that's not to say that it won't find itself in the crosshairs again in future. So we will continue to watch this closely, as it would have global ramifications for SSA and space traffic coordination. On the international level, we will be watching discussions in COPUOS on SSA information sharing. The committee decided at its June meeting to establish a new expert group on this topic that will be chaired by the UAE, which will begin its work next February. And we will be watching to see how the expertise of the commercial space operators can be incorporated into this effort. On the space security front, we will be watching the open-ended working group on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. This group met in Geneva last week, and despite the very challenging geopolitical context, we hear that productive, substantive discussions were held. So we're looking forward to the future work of this group, and we will be following it with interest. On the lunar activities front, COPUOS has an action team for lunar activities consultation, or ATLAC as it's known by its acronym. And we will be watching the work of this group with interest as we get closer to the US and China landing human space missions on the moon. And lastly, we will continue to monitor the discussions on long-term sustainability of space activities in COPUOS, but also monitor the implementation of the already adopted space sustainability guidelines by the UN member states. So those are some of the things we'll be focusing on over the next 12 to 18 months.
It sounds like a very busy schedule for the next 12 months, as you said. Peter, thank you very much for your time and the insights. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in Paris, maybe at the World Space Business Week, the upcoming one, or your own summit then in October. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you to your listeners. Thank you.
If you have further questions, reach out to us at radio@SpaceWatch.Global. If you like these or other episodes of Space Café Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.SpaceWatch.Global and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Thorsten Triening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, your independent perspective on space.